The Athletic.
The race is on, and Max Verstappen won again, keeping at bay a charging Lando Norris in the final stint. But was this back to business as usual on a conventional track, or has the Spanish Grand Prix proved that Red Bull really is under pressure? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to tell all are Mark Hughes and Ben Anderson. Well, Ben, we'll come to you first. I'll ask you how you're doing, even though I've been driving you around all weekend. A relatively rare appearance these days for you at the track for the weekend, although obviously you've got vast paddock experience in F1s. How did you enjoy it?
Yes, I enjoyed it very much. The chauffeuring was a bit sketchy at times, I have to say, but I'm still in one piece. We made it to the circuit every day. We had some decent Spanish weather, and we had a very, very interesting and intriguing Grand Prix weekend as well.
Well, that's the really, really good thing. And just to clarify, Mark, even though Ben's complained about my driving, at no stage did I go up a one-way street the wrong way, as I was doing in Austin multiple times the other year. So you haven't missed out on anything too terrifying.
So he's improving then, you would say?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That's good.
That's what it's all about. Me and Logan Sargent all making progress towards our inevitable driving fate. But anyway, but it was interesting, wasn't it, Mark? We hoped that it might be a bit closer than we thought it might be, and it absolutely was. So that this is all very intriguing. So lots to get into.
Yeah, it really was promising a lot on the Friday, and into Saturday FP3 even. It was looking like there were 4 teams in it. As it turned out, when it came to the really important stuff, Norris and Verstappen in the McLaren and Red Bull pulled a decisive margin out over the others. But their particular struggle lasted, right away from Q3 until the flag at the end of the race. And it was a very, very interesting comparison. And it answered one of the questions that we all had coming into this weekend, with this being such a classically aerodynamically demanding circuit. Would it mean that the Red Bull would re-establish its early superiority? And the answer to that is a resounding no. It still was the fastest through the fast corners, but over the lap, the balance of the McLaren made it probably the better car, certainly the more flexible car, and Red Bull having all sorts of drama trying to get the car into its sweet spot, a little bit like at Imola, changing the wing level on the eve of qualifying, and really having to pull a rabbit out of the hat to get it to somewhere near its peak potential pace. And then in the race, it won the race within seconds of the start, simply because of the way the choreography played out between Verstappen starting Lando's, and with George Russell complicating things by going around the outside of them both. And that turned out to be absolutely the crucial element in separating out Verstappen and Norris. I think whichever one of those two had been ahead of the other one coming out of turn 1 would have won the race. It was really as close as that.
Yeah, that was exactly the great thing to see. I asked Andrea Stella, the McLaren team principal, after the race what he thought, all things being equalised, the relative pace was, and he felt that Norris and Verstappen, much of a muchness. So let's just dig a little bit into the way the race played out, as we often start off with, Mark. You've sort of talked about the big picture stuff there, but obviously there was some strategic intrigue, wasn't there? So once Verstappen was ahead, can you just explain how Norris's attempts to try and get back into it worked out?
Yeah, well, Verstappen put that very aggressive early pass on Russell going into lap 3. And he used the Red Bull's fantastic grip through that final corner, that flat-out final corner, to get a really good run on him. And when the Red Bull's tyre advantage was at its greatest, the Red Bull's very, very good early in the stint. The McLaren was very strong later in the stint. So with the tyre advantage at its maximum, Max put a really decisive pass on Russell. Russell didn't fight it. He seemed to be expecting it. Norris reasoned at that moment, sitting in third place, he knew his fight was not with Russell. Ultimately, it was with Max. But he reasoned that trying to put a pass like that on Russell in the McLaren, which its speed profile was slightly different to that of the Red Bulls, was not going to help him. His best way of doing it was just to look after his tyres as best he could, so they could run long, which was always the plan. They were always going to run long, even if they led into the first corner, and in that way, have the tyre advantage later on. So he was just sort of biding his time. And it was Mercedes that pulled the plug first, because they reasoned that there's no point trying to go out longer than a faster car, i.e. Norris. You definitely lose the position that way. So they came in to defend against that. That was very early, lap 15. And Hamilton followed in on the next lap. And so with Max, then, they were, the tyre deg was so high that the new tyred cars were going a lot faster even than Max. So as that was happening, Norris was catching Verstappen very quickly, and that's where we saw the McLaren end of stint speed for the first time. And so in order to defend against that, Red Bull brought Verstappen in on a very early lap 17, really, for what was going to be a two-stop race. And that was perfect for Norris to try and limit the damage of the time he'd lost to Russell, because it allowed him to do that long stint, stayed out an extra 6 laps after Verstappen, which gave him that big tyre advantage. Now, that also meant, of course, that he'd been undercut by the Mercs and the Ferraris. But the deg is so high here that the difference in pace would be fine. When he was asked, "Do you want to cover those guys off?" and he said, "No, let's concentrate on doing what's best to try and race Max." So that's what happened. But unfortunately, it did take a while to get past those cars, especially George, who was put up a hell of a defence in that second stint. And it was great racing, but it did sort of cost a lot of tyre life for them both. But yet again, as soon as Norris got up to second place, he was way faster than Max. And it looked like his end of stint advantage was maybe 8/10, something like that. And so again, the same thing played out over again, with Red Bull bringing Verstappen in a bit earlier, Norris running a little bit longer, then coming back out, having lost a bit of time due to the undercut effect, and then just chasing. But it was all under control by Max and Red Bull by that point. They had track position, and that's all they really needed to have. So I think Norris was adamant after the race. We had the fastest car today. It was all decided at the start, and Verstappen seemed to agree with him. He seemed to be thinking, we're good in certain corners, but there are other corners where we're just not, and we're certainly not able to look after the tyres as well as their car. Now, how much of that is how each of those two drivers decided to do their races, and how much is the car traits, is up for debate. And I know McLaren's Andrea Stella reckons there's very little difference, and it was just down to the circumstances. But I'd say, looking at the pattern of the races in Miami and Imola, there's very strong evidence to suggest that the McLaren's tyre usage is considerably better than the Red Bulls in terms of race stints. So that's what we were seeing. And I think, had Norris come out of that first turn ahead of Max, we would have seen quite an interesting race between them. We would have seen Max really pushing hard early in the stint to try and get Norris to do something. But then as the pit window opened, Norris, it would have been coinciding roughly with when Norris's pace advantage would be building. So he'd probably have been able to pull himself out of undercut range and would have been able to control the race from the front, just as Verstappen was able to do. So the traits of the two cars was not as significant as what happened at the start in determining the outcome.
It says a lot about how much this season has evolved since the early stages, that we used to when we asked you how the race played out, and if you talked about the race at the front, it was like, well, Verstappen was in the quickest car and he was just comfortably ahead, but there was so much nuance and detail in there. But what I thought really stood out is almost the fact it was so condensed at the front worked against that duel, because obviously, Ben, we saw George Russell made that great start, swooped around the outside. He said he'd actually sort of worked on that one before and practiced it a little bit on the recce laps, even trying to go around the outside. So what did you make of the way that the actual start bit and how George Russell kind of made himself the confounding factor in, well, both of the top two's race, but primarily Lando Norris's?
Yeah, it was a decisive moment. I mean, Russell said he'd taken inspiration from Fernando Alonso's fourth to first start at the 2012 Spanish Grand Prix. So he'd obviously done his homework and, as you mentioned, practiced that particular move. Obviously, the front two were very focused on each other, and as often happens when two people are very focused on each other, it allows someone else to steal around. I think Norris was overly harsh on himself about the start. His actual initial launch was quite good, but we know that Red Bull, and this is all about those absolutely tiny details that can make a difference when it's become so close. Red Bull have done so much work on the starts, making sure every phase of the launch is really strong and as strong as it can be. It does look like they're still a step ahead there compared to McLaren, and I thought you saw that played out in those early yards as Verstappen came at Norris in the second phase, and that ultimately allowed him to get down the inside into turn one. Yes, Russell was a confounding factor, but the crucial thing was Verstappen getting ahead of Norris into turn one. And then the second crucial thing was that Verstappen, I think with Red Bull's characteristics being slightly more biased towards the high speed and a bit less drag, maybe, he was able to nail Russell as soon as the DRS was available, get ahead and build a buffer. Norris couldn't attack Russell in the same way. And so when you then figure how the race might have played out without the confounding factor of Russell, well, Verstappen probably would have passed Norris into turn one, and then it would have been a straight fight between, as Mark said, Red Bull's early stint pace and McLaren's later stint pace. Yes, it did look like the McLaren was kinder, but I still felt like Red Bull is usually a bit quicker in race trim than it is in qualifying trim, and I still felt like Max had some in reserve. We just never got to see that obviously play out in a straight fight. If Norris had been ahead all the way, I think he probably would have won the race. Yes, just because of how well the McLaren looked after its tyres on a high deg track. Verstappen would have had to attack him early, but of course the Red Bull being so good in race trim, he might have been able to overtake Norris on track. I feel like if Norris had been chasing Max, I don't think the McLaren's characteristic would have allowed him, without a mistake, to have passed Verstappen on track for the lead.
There was one thing about the start from Norris that I thought was really impressive, and it might be a little bit counterintuitive. Obviously, he actually got a really good initial launch. The second phase, a bit of wheel spin. The Red Bulls were really good in the second phase with Verstappen. But actually, there was a point when they're heading down to the first corner, and obviously Russell had initially been on the right of the track, and then he kind of worked his way across and just managed to slip sort of behind the rear left of Norris and ahead of the Ferrari that was
went around the blind side, basically, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. But what I thought was really impressive was Norris found himself going down towards that first corner, approaching it, and he was in the middle lane, and I was watching it, and I remember saying, you sat by me, I said, there's going to be a collision here. Because
yes, there usually is, isn't there?
What it needed is for one of them, and it had to be the one in the middle lane to back out and be sensible. And I think it was very, very good that Norris, he knew that the start had gone a bit against him, but he had the wisdom,
as Andrea Stella called it.
And people say, he was too conservative. No, nothing good would have come from Norris not backing out of that.
Yeah, it was a shunt.
He did well to back out, ensure that he consolidated third and lived to fight another day. And ideally, you wouldn't want to be in that position, but I thought that was good racecraft from Norris. You often talk about, it's about making those decisions, risk versus reward. Russell made a good calculation. Asked him how high risk he thought it was, given Norris did have to lift off, and he said, "No, I planned this. This was right on the money. I knew this was going to work."
The way he went into turn one, you could tell as exactly, well. It wasn't one of these kind of gung-ho Sergio Perez Mexico type moves.
No, it was completely controlled,
Yeah, really under control.
I thought that was outstanding from Russell, but very clever from Norris just to think, do you know what? I'm just going to end up with damage in the runoff along with George Russell and possibly Verstappen. Chances are Verstappen would have just driven off.
But you just know if he hadn't been so circumspect, Verstappen would have just disappeared to victory while Norris and Russell ended up in a heap.
Ended up in a heap with bits hanging off the car. So yeah, I thought that was quite good from Norris. But we should talk about the McLaren brushes with wins, Ben.
Yeah.
It was close in Imola, wasn't it? It was close in Monaco, close in Canada, close here, and Norris was kicking himself. It's not just was this a missed opportunity, because as we've established, had Norris been ahead at the start, every chance he could have won. Had he been just behind Verstappen after the start, could have attacked him, but they were kind of separated early on. But how big a missed opportunity, and is there a worrying pattern here, or do you think it's all positive for McLaren that things are getting so good and that they can actually at the end of the race say, yeah, we were as quick as Red Bull?
Yeah, I think that's the major thing. It's easy to forget now that coming into the weekend we expected Red Bull to restore a gap, a significant gap. It wasn't there in qualifying. As Mark mentioned earlier, they're under so much pressure now that it's becoming about the details of execution even for Red Bull. Have they got exactly the right setup for the given session? They definitely feel like, and they're not the only team that feels this, that they're reaching the kind of limit of the regulations in terms of development potential now. So obviously we're seeing convergence. McLaren, I don't know if you've had the chance to ask Stella this, but I don't feel like they feel that they're at that same point yet. Coming into this season, they certainly felt that there was still a linear slope of development. We didn't see it from race one. We've definitely seen a big jump since that Miami upgrade went on Norris's car. And they seem to have made the biggest gain in one go of any of those top teams. The others have been kind of chipping away at bits. Red Bull inevitably will find that chipping away process harder because they're leading the championship. They have fewer hours of wind tunnel time available. The rules are designed to restrict their potential to get ahead. But other teams in McLaren's vicinity, Mercedes and Ferrari, have also been making gains. Mercedes a bit more impressive, Ferrari a bit less impressive. So it feels like McLaren are still on a really good trajectory. I think this circuit was fascinating in terms of, trying every team having to find a compromise between the high and low speed and the mid-speed sections of the track. There's a full range there, almost not quite as peak low speed as when the chicane was there, but there's still this similar compromise globally. And I felt that Red Bull was at one end of it. McLaren were probably in the sweet spot as best you can, overall compromise middle bit. And then Mercedes and Ferrari were kind of slightly off one way or the other. I think Ferrari a little bit better in the low speed and a bit weaker in the high speed, and Mercedes the other way round. Yeah,
McLaren are in a good place because they've got it's a decent all-round car now. It's going to be thereabouts at worst everywhere now, which is great.
That you're not able to do so well at the end of stints unless your car is benign. And probably over the course of this weekend, on balance, it was the most benign car to drive. You could see even from the early parts of Friday practice, not so much compared to the Red Bull, because when I was watching at Turn 4, there was a bit of an offset in terms of the run plan. But certainly compared to the Ferrari, there was a point where Leclerc and Norris were doing very similar things and definitely going for it. And you could see as they came into Turn 4, there was just this extra delay with the Ferrari. It wasn't as joined up between the entry and the exit phase. Leclerc was having to wait for the car to do something to respond. Whereas with Norris, it had a little bit of that. I think it's inescapable in a long corner like that. And long corners are obviously a very good test of the sort of aerodynamic stability of a car. Norris had so much less time to wait in that corner, and that was even from the first session. So the point at which McLaren began the weekend, at least on his car, was in a much, much better place than the teams around him, or certainly some of the teams around them.
Mark, we talked about the two are fighting at the front, but conspicuous by their absence was Sergio Perez and the other Red Bull, only 8th, who finished well behind Oscar Piastri and the other McLaren. So why were the second drivers struggling so much?
Yeah, with Piastri, it's unusual. It's against the pattern of the season. And he was quite frank in admitting he'd no idea why he just didn't have the feel for the car around here this weekend. It just he wasn't able to unlock it at any stage. Just few little glimpses every now and again. He set a very quick sector 2 time and then went off in qualifying. Ran wide, and then he had his lap disallowed. But generally, no, he just wasn't even in the same on the same page as Norris this weekend, and that's the first time we've seen that really. And so, yeah, it'd be interesting to know whether they find anything with the car or whether it's just one of those things where something hasn't clicked for a particular driver. With Perez, it's part of a pattern, but in fairness to them, they were pulling all sorts of wildly different setups on him as they tried to figure out between the two cars what they needed to do to get the car to work. And he had that plus his 3-place grid penalty for driving back to the pits with a damaged car in Montreal. So he was, given that he had that sort of nightmare build-up to it, to sort of do what he did on a 3-stop and come back and get into the lower end points is I suppose was okay, but just he's going through that very familiar nightmare middle phase of his season. It's been like this for the last 2 seasons. So we'll just have to see if he pulls out of it. But for Piastri, I'd be surprised if this was any sort of pattern for the future.
Whatever it was for Piastri, he was locked into it from the earliest laps. I mean, I tried to grill him a bit on this on Saturday, and he refused to blame the car. He said it wasn't even one particular area of the track he was struggling with. It was every session he was chasing something different and just kind of moving the problem around. And he just felt that everyone else. I mean, I thought to myself, well, this is a track everyone knows really well. Teams and drivers, surely, you'd start on the front foot, you'd expect to. And he was like, well, everyone else, because of that, is starting at a much higher level. You don't get so much time to build through the practice sessions. And I think Piastri tends to be a driver who likes to build through the weekend. So if you start off, as Leclerc found, it's very hard to catch up, especially also as the peak performance of the tyre only gives you 1 lap. So your key laps through the practice sessions are quite minimal. And I just think he could just never wrap his head around it in a weekend where the pace was so hot. And Perez, I mean, he was very evasive at the start of the weekend in terms of these ongoing problems, mentioning vague mechanical and aero issues, so basically anything with the car. But in terms of the race, he did eventually say after the race that he was struggling particularly on the soft tyre, and his main limitation was with the front. He said, I'm front limited on the entries, particularly the slower corners, and I just can't get the rotation I want. It's something I've been struggling with for the last few races, and they, as you mentioned, Mark, they've been throwing setups at it to try and fix it, and they haven't found a solution yet. So yeah, he seems to be stuck in yet another Sergio Perez death spiral.
Right, Ben, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell were 3rd and 4th. The car wasn't far off in qualifying. So does the performance here convince you that Mercedes is now on the right track?
It does seem that way. Montreal was surprisingly good, I think, for everyone. Maybe not for Mercedes so much, but George Russell did say that he felt that that front wing final piece of the puzzle had been more powerful than even they expected. So perhaps it's fair to say there was an element of surprise across the board, but we always knew this would be a much sterner test because of the track compromises, and they were there. They weren't right there, but they were close. They were able to pit Ferrari. They were knocking on the door earlier in the weekend. It felt like as the track gripped up and the business end of qualifying came around, Red Bull and McLaren just had a little bit more to give and a little bit more control over the aero platform that they'd gone with, whereas Mercedes and Ferrari were giving. I felt Mercedes and Ferrari were having to give away a little bit in different areas. As I mentioned, I think the Mercs had really they have worked out how to have low and high speed performance rather than just one or the other, like it was the case early in the season. But I think here, in terms of the compromise, they were still slightly biased towards the high speed and giving away in the low. And as I say, Ferrari were the other way around. So because those two teams were just a little bit more limited overall, it just meant that they were still that step behind Red Bull and McLaren, at least in Max and Norris's hands. But, Hamilton on the podium, it was a very, very strong weekend for Mercedes on a track where, if they hadn't figured the car out, you would have expected them to struggle.
Yeah, George Russell was very, very positive. He said after qualifying, this is the sort of most confident they've been in the past 3 seasons. And he said after the race, we're definitely going to win races this year, which I took to mean win on merit. So very, very positive. And I must admit, I'm quite, for the first time in a long time, I'm quite positive about Mercedes. They're on the right trajectory. How fast they can progress along that trajectory, that's the thing, question, isn't it? But reason to be optimistic. But Mark, Lewis Hamilton, obviously, having probably certainly his strongest weekend in terms of results. Obviously, the battle with Russell, once again, they kind of diverged a bit on strategy. But what did you make of Hamilton's performance? Do you think he's sort of picking up a bit with the car?
Yes, it's like a good confidence base for him, I would think. A respectable performance. Narrowly outqualified his teammate. And, was able to run long enough to get onto the soft tyre for the end, which allowed him to overtake George and get that podium. So, very respectable performance. Nothing startling, but it was, I think, good, solid baseline.
Let's move on to Ferrari now, Ben.
Yeah.
5th and 6th with Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. 4th best of the group of teams near the front. So why weren't they properly at the races?
Yeah, compared to Barcelona 2023, it was a pretty good race for Ferrari. But obviously, compared to how they started this season, I think it's fair to say it was a disappointment. They have slipped back from being the clear second best. And there seems to be a pattern now where, even Mercedes are now able to pick them off. You can argue the toss a bit. I mean, Fred Vasseur, in typically defensive mode after the race, was saying, well, the qualifying gap to Mercedes was a gust of wind. So they could have easily have been 3rd and 4th on the grid rather than 5th or 6th, and it's a different race, but you're still talking about a deficit to Verstappen and Norris.
And this is a car that was the clear second best in the early phase of the season. Yeah,
McLaren's overtaken it, I think, on balance. I mean, Vasseur's clinging to the fact that, the past 4 weekends you've had 4 different cars on pole position. And, everyone's kind of within 0.2 depending on the track configuration and how.
But Ferrari's done it on the most absurd outlier of the season.
Yes, and I put that to him. I said, Monaco's the one that's the outlier. But then, of course, he starts saying, well, yeah, but if we win in Singapore, if we win in Baku, that's pretty good.
All the outliers.
He's essentially saying, yeah, well, we can be the king of the outliers. But he's also saying that. You can't predict the pattern necessarily because it's now so close in terms of the pure pace. It comes down to the specific, minute details of the track, how they intersect with the car, and also how you execute the weekend. So I think he kind of feels like Ferrari. I mean, he didn't criticise Ferrari for having a bad weekend. Obviously, it was much better than Canada. But I think it's become clear that the Ferrari, where the McLaren has managed to become this sort of all-rounder at the front, that's maybe on Red Bull's pace, maybe not quite in all circumstances. The Merc and the Ferrari too, they just still have slight biases where they're stronger in certain areas and weaker in others. And the Ferrari, by the fact that it won Monaco so convincingly, obviously it's better at low speed. At high speed, it's giving away. And he said, particularly using the tyre through the whole lap in Barcelona with DEG so high, even in qualifying, you have to be managing the tyres. And they just weren't able to keep the tyre life for the end of the lap quite to the same extent as others. I think they run into bouncing problems at high speed and max power and high grip as well compared to McLaren and Red Bull. And through the final 2 fast sweeps, they just didn't have enough front tyre left to do the final bit of lap time.
Well, this is the concern for me for Ferrari, because of these rules, there's various different limitations you butt up against, and different cars have different problems, and it depends how hard those limitations are and whether you can get the compromise. I don't know about you, Mark, but I'm a little bit worried now about Ferrari because this bouncing at a high speed limitation, which Carlos Sainz also suggested, made it harder in qualifying to make the tyres last as well as they should have done over a single lap. That feels like something that's proving quite persistent and stubborn at the moment, and that feels like a limit they're going to butt up against, not at every circuit, but any circuit that's got a decent amount of high speed corners. That's going to be a big problem for them.
Yeah, I think it's Barcelona's going to be at the extreme end of that just because of the range of corner speeds. But yes, it is clearly something that they do run into a limitation with. And Sainz mentioned that they're a little bit off for the pace in China and Suzuka as well, which is a similar sort of high speed, high load, long corners. So yes, it is also track specific in that the Monaco, yes, it has got very good mechanical traits at low speed, but it's also got a very particular power unit trait which works very well out of low-speed corners, which comes to its aid. So, there's a reason why it's got a slightly unusual performance profile, but yes, Ben's right. It has been basically just completely overtaken by McLaren, and McLaren has put itself in the same league as Red Bull, and Ferrari is now in a similar situation to Mercedes, where it's, it can be there, it can be a contender on the right sort of track, and it's there are probably more victories in store for it during the season, I would imagine. But I think if you're looking for the season-long battle, it's Verstappen versus the McLarens.
I'd be a bit worried about Ferrari's rate of development this season based on the jumps McLaren have been able to make. But for Sir, when I put this to him, the Ferrari drivers were talking up McLaren, saying, it looks like, they're properly ahead of us. And he was saying, but if you go back a year and look at Silverstone, we were almost 20 or 20-something seconds behind McLaren, so I'm not sure the rate of development's any different. So he's got an answer for everything at the moment, but I felt like he was kind of in a slight protective defensive mode this weekend, because it was disappointing for him to see Ferrari not at least second best.
Yeah, very, very much so. Concerns for them there. Upgrades they had here that apparently deliver what they should have done, but a few question marks there. Let's move on to Alpine now. And Mark, it's very, very odd because we're going to say some nice things about Alpine, because Gasly was 9th, Ocon was 10th, 7th in the Constructors' Championship. Now they've even moved up to 8th fastest on the sort of single lap pace tracker that we keep. So where's that
Briatore magic?
Well, exactly. Well, we may address Briatore a little bit later, but where has that pace come from, and how on earth have we got to a point where Pierre Gasly is able to qualify within half a second of pole position around this track of all tracks?
Yeah, there's it was a very nicely balanced car. You could see that from the onboards. Gasly, particularly in the high-speed stuff, just lovely one-sweep movement on the steering wheel. The car had a nice, consistent balance through the different speed corners, and that's a very important quality around here. But I think it's also a reflection of how the top teams, as they've run the cars lower and lower, are finding the limitations with this regulation set to be one of you're trading off balance for downforce, and I mean in terms of balance of having a good balance at both low speed and high, or you might have to get that, you may have to lose some peak downforce. And the top teams are obviously they're reluctant to do that. They're trying to get the downforce and have the good balance. And
so greedy.
Yeah, and of the top teams, the McLaren's the most successful in doing that, and the Red Bull is encountering difficulties. So you're seeing a sort of false ceiling, well, not false ceiling, but a ceiling being put on the Red Bull concept.
A hard floor, Mark.
Yeah. And I think the Alpine performance just showed what the value of a good, consistent balance was around that track. And all credit to them, because it won't have happened by accident. There's been a lot of very diligent research and simulation will have gone into that, and it sort of all came together very nicely for them. Both cars making Q3 as well.
I think worth a tip of a hat to Pierre Gasly as well, because although Ocon was up there as well, Gasly was a step ahead and he drove really well. Actually, his qualifying lap was interesting because the slightly lower speed balance of the car wasn't kind of classic Gasly territory, but he managed it very well on the qualifying lap. So he's after that slightly shaky start to the season, he seems to be really getting somewhere, which is encouraging for him. Let's move on now, Ben, to Williams. They had a particularly bad weekend, so why so slow?
Oh, well, yeah, speaking of cars that were or maybe remain overweight, there's a stark difference. Not a great sign for what's meant to be the all-rounder now. I think I came into this weekend thinking, this has been quite a big test of, the Williams change of direction, but it seemed that they were limited by old problems. Alex Albon was complaining about the wind, saying it blew him off track in the race, particularly. He didn't really have any. There were a few guys this weekend who weren't complaining of any particular problem with the balance of the car. This goes from Leclerc through to Albon, through to the RB drivers in qualifying, but the pace just wasn't there. Certainly the pace they were expecting. But on Logan Sargent's car, he was supposedly at the same spec, but the floor wasn't working, and he had a horrible time. High deg, no pace, described it as the worst weekend he'd ever had in Formula One. So
a disaster,
yeah, and it really was. They were comfortably the slowest, having recently, been bothering the top 10, and certainly being up a Q2 in with Sargent and Albon were both in Q3 when they in Canada. But I mean, it's a similar story to last year, isn't it? Canada was one of Williams' best tracks last year, and Spain was the opposite, and we've just seen the same thing. So it kind of feels like there hasn't really been any progress at Williams, even though there sort of has been. So yeah, quite a confusing one.
The interesting thing was their qualifying deficit to the front was to within, it was about 0.002% different compared to here last year. So they've gone with the average in front, but they haven't made a net gain, which they would have been hoping to do. And Albon said he wasn't expecting much, but he was expecting more from here. So this was never going to be a good circuit for them. But yeah, the fact it wasn't, I think even if Albon had been absolutely perfect in Q1, which he wasn't quite, he wouldn't have been in Q2.
He was slightly undercooked at the start of the lap, wasn't he? But
so
I mean, it was a poor weekend for Williams, I think.
Exactly. And that flaw thing with Sargent, that definitely does seem to be a thing. It's not just an excuse. And when you've got a team that seems to be struggling to produce things that are working exactly as they should, it wasn't working as well as Albon's flaw. And in fact, Sargent suggested on Saturday that was the reason why he didn't have the flaw last time. So if you remember, he said before the Canadian Grand Prix weekend on Thursday, I'm going to have the new spec, and then he suddenly didn't. And so there's something going on there. We assume in manufacturing in some way, shape or form where something's not quite working as hyped.
Still chasing their tails.
Exactly. So it's going to take a little bit of time for him to get the long-awaited parity. Might not even be until after the summer break. Who knows? And now, Mark, Scott isn't here. He will be back, of course, after the Austrian Grand Prix. So I'm actually going to invite you to one of our favourite places on this podcast.
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
So now we're here in Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner, Mark. He qualified so well in 12th, but why was he an anonymous 16th in the race?
Yeah, he did a really nice job in qualifying. Got the car solidly in the Q2, half a second faster than his teammate. And I think that was about as much as you could have asked of that car in qualifying. But yeah, for some reason in the race, they did a very odd tyre sequence. They did soft, hard. So they had 3 opportunities to use the best tyre, which was the medium, and turned it down on all occasions. So the the soft that they put on at the first stop, obviously you didn't get very much range from, and he had to come in early from that, and it was, they then stuck the hard on to get him to the end, and it's just the worst possible combination, really. So that's I don't know if Valtteri was aware that was the plan for the tyre run plan, but that's what he got, and that's how it played out.
Yeah, he said, I think we calculated a bit wrong of that strategy when I asked him about it after the race. So it was a shame because he did qualify really, really well. He was in a great mood after qualifying. In fact, just after he finished speaking to us, he hung around just because Q3 was just finishing. Obviously, he'd been eliminating Q2, and he just looked at us and gave a prediction of, I think he thought it was going to be Verstappen, Norris, Hamilton, the top 3. And so I said, right, this is a test of your punditry credentials. And it wasn't quite right, but he had the right top 3. So we had a bit of a debate about whether he had a punditry future.
He definitely deserves sympathy this weekend because his performance on Saturday was probably one of his best of the season. As Mark said, he absolutely smashed his teammate, and to end up so reversed in the race, it wasn't really befitting of the performance he put in, I don't think.
But quite befitting of what seems to happen at Sauber at the moment. Yeah, real a shame, but yeah, that's why Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner exists. Right, let's get into some questions from the Race Members Club for our usual final part of the podcast. If you're interested in getting in on the act, check out our Patreon page for more details, and there will be a link in the episode description to click on as well. We'll try and get through as many as we can, and we will probably have a full questions podcast episode soon. We're not sure exactly when during this triple header because it depends on what other news surfaces, etc., but you'll see that at the latest after the triple header, and we're going to aim to do a members bonus episode as well that will go out before the Austrian Grand Prix. So we'll get through as many as we can, but we're getting loads, so we have to unfortunately be a little bit selective, and it's a shame because there's so many great questions. Right, Mark, I'll stop talking so we can get on with them. Bo Albert says, is Lando's don't settle for P2, always push for the win mentality simply because he doesn't believe the championship is possible this year and that risking safe points for a chance at the win is more worthwhile for him and the team?
I think that establishing themselves as regular winners is sort of step one on the way to being a championship contender. But I think they're taking it one step at a time. And I think rather than getting carried away thinking let's fight for the championship, they're fighting each race as it comes. And I think somewhere distant in the back of their minds is the idea that we might still be in contention for this championship, but I don't think it's the overriding thing that's driving them on at the moment. I think it's just the excitement of narrowing that gap down to Red Bull and taking them on and trying to beat this sort of winning combination. It's just so all round excellent at every little detail, and I think that process is. It's probably a very satisfying and exciting one, and I think it's just that. It's just that. The finishing third or fourth or fifth is of no interest. It's let's take on Verstappen.
And it's 69 points the advantage Verstappen's got over Norris, who's now second in the championship. So it would take a lot for that kind of gap to close down. Very, very few cases where more than 2 wins worth of points have been closed down. The next question for you, Ben, comes from Gavin Cameron. A significant question because it's the first question that's come through our Patreon, seeing that we keep talking about. So it's the same whether you're Patreon or the old form of the Race Members Club membership, but it's a landmark one. So Gavin Cameron's question is, will Lando Norris's negativity, as exemplified by the post-race radio, hurt him if and when he gets into a championship battle?
Well, Gavin, I don't think so, because if we consider this negativity is not negativity for negativity's sake. It's hyper criticism designed to spur him and his team on to the greater pursuit of excellence. It's the kind of trait that we admire in Max Verstappen, the man he's trying to topple. Whenever Max feels that Red Bull's left performance on the table or messed up in a qualifying session or a race, he is absolutely blunt and hard on the team and himself if it's ever him in terms of, we need to improve. And I think it's the same trait we see in Lando. He wants to be an elite driver in an elite team, and you don't get that way by just patting yourself on the back all the time. I mean, you maybe argue that he's being overly critical at the moment of himself, but Andrea Stella at McLaren says it's Lando's style to be like that, and you have to sometimes disconnect the style from the content of what's happened. In this particular instance, I don't think he did a lot wrong. I imagine that second phase of the start thing that cost him so dearly in terms of his track position with Max was down to something McLaren needs to work on in terms of its start procedure and the clutch and power delivery and everything else. It's work that Red Bull are ahead on because they've been chasing those marginal gains sooner than McLaren. So it's just a case of continuing to push and eliminate the weaknesses.
And next up is a question I'll take from Kyle Tyler Biggs, who asks, is Renault getting ready to sell off its stake in Team Enstone once again with the announcement of Flavio Briatore's return as executive advisor? If so, who would Flavio potentially court as a new owner, and what chance would they have of turning the fortunes around? I'm going to give a very brief answer on this one, simply because we're probably going to do a much bigger episode on Alpine imminently, so we'll get into that there. But they say it is not for sale. When they unveiled to the staff privately on Thursday before the race that Briatore was returning, they said the team is not being sold. I think there's a chance that might be part of the possible options because Briatore is a great person to bring in if you were to look at doing that. So maybe it's one of those options that's on the table, but there are other things.
They're lying to the staff, basically.
No, not necessarily, but as I put it in the article I wrote, not being especially positive about this return, given his history with this team, if I was there, I wouldn't entirely believe that assurance. And that's based on Renault's history with Formula One and Luca Di Maio's history with this particular team. And I hope I'm wrong, because for everybody working hard at Enstone, also very on the engine side, because it's the two sides of the same coin, that team. They deserve to have a good run at it and really fulfil their potential, because there's some great people there. So I wouldn't be surprised, but there are other things he's going to do: Concord Agreement stuff, driver stuff, big strategic stuff.
Who could he sell it to, though?
Cetera. Oh, there's loads of people out there, aren't there? I mean, there are
Andretti.
Well, Andretti, but as I understand it, Andretti are an absolute hard no on trying to buy Alpine at the moment. Could change, who knows? But there are. I mean, every team that could be for sale has got multiple people who have inquired, ostensibly serious people. Now, when it comes to parting company with the kind of money that these teams are worth, whether that money's genuinely there or not is another matter. But there are a lot of people. If somebody put up a for sale sign on their F1 team, which they wouldn't do because you don't want to seem like you're a motivated
yeah,
seller,
you want to give it away.
They would be inundated with people, and although there'll be the usual chancers and optimists, there'll be
Flavio good at sifting those.
Oh, Flavio, yeah, he will know how to tell the difference.
He can spot a chance or a mile off.
exactly. And I would say I'm not a big fan of this appointment. He's allowed to work in Formula One, no problem. He's worked for F1 itself, other teams, no problem. But
bad look for them, isn't
same
it?
team, same majority ownership. Given what happened before, I'm not keen on that. But I do think Briatore has a lot of skills that can bring useful things to that team.
And facilitate a sale.
Possibly. So I will, we'll talk more about that soon, but I want us to have a quick bite at that now. And Mark, a question from Don Anderson now. Did Red Bull cost Sergio Perez a position by not putting him on hards for a final stint?
Possibly putting him on softs, lap 49. The soft should still have been the faster tyre in theory. It's 17 laps to go. Yeah, 17 laps. Soft should have been a faster tyre over that stint than the hard. The hard was even slower than forecast. So, yeah, maybe it was particularly working the soft particularly hard. So it might, if you were able to run it again, it might have worked out better for him if they'd done hard. But I don't think it was a fundamental error. I think, every bit of data that they would have had at that time would have suggested the soft should have been able to do that stint on a low fuel load quite comfortably.
Ben, next up a question for you from Tamara Salter, also from Patreon. Why did the upgrades not work for the RBs? They were nowhere during qualifying in the race.
Hello, Tamara. Yes, so I think it's possible that the upgrades were working. There were teams, like Ferrari, who put upgrades on, saw the numbers they expected, but for whatever reason didn't manage to extract the pace from them. It could be that there are kind of two separate things going on. So you upgrade the car and you make it better fundamentally in terms of the data you're seeing, but the demands of the circuit mean that you're not able to translate all of that performance into something the driver can access. We know the RB is a better car at low speed. It's an outlier really in that regard across the grid compared to high speed. Obviously they've had quite a consistent run of being upper top of the midfield and bothering Aston Martin and Mercedes sometimes earlier in the season. But I suspect, given that the drivers are reporting no real problems with the balance in qualifying and just not being able to have any lap time from the car, that the compromises of Barcelona and the need to trade off between the high, medium and low speed just meant that where they ran the RB, trying to find the middle of that compromise just meant that it was kind of ineffective in almost all corner types. And they ended up in a kind of Williams situation just without the wind sensitivity.
Yeah, it shows how difficult it is with these regulations to get a car that's in the right place all the time. Yeah, the next question I'll take from Jay Menon. Apologies for such a blunt question, but what on earth is going on at Aston Martin? Well, we like a blunt question. Ultimately, they're not making as much progress as they need to. In Spain, the big problem was they're not great in long corners. That's been a problem for quite a while. And as Fernando Alonso was saying after the race, just haven't got enough.
We need to talk less and do more.
Enough downforce. Yeah. And how did you find Fernando Alonso's talking less after the race, Ben?
Yes, he was very short with me when I tried to ask him about the performance profile of the car and what it was lacking around this circuit, and he just said downforce. And I said, well, is that, have you got a balance issue too? And he was like, no, it's just peak load. I felt like maybe he's said too much during the weekend about what Aston's lacking, and also this upgrade they've got coming. They just need to survive the triple header. And then they've got this, next package that's probably not going to work going on the car. And it feels like maybe Alonso's starting to put a little bit of public pressure on the team to actually deliver what they're promising.
Yeah, they need that step. There seems to be some confidence there that there will be a step from that. They've battled these characteristics, and it's challenge of these regs, getting a car that works across the board. And Barcelona, as well as being that pure aero test, there's a wide range of corner speeds here, and they struggled here last year. But I did ask Tom McCulloch about that at Aston Martin this morning, and he said, look, the car is night and day better here than it was 12 months ago. But it's like we said with Williams, if you're not moving at the same rate as others, then you're struggling.
Hard to set up to, wasn't it? Because on Friday, Alonso was saying we are so far out of the window. So they didn't hit the ground running in Barcelona, definitely, and were probably chasing their tails a bit, having basically wasted Friday. So that won't have helped.
Yeah, that made it basically not quite a top 10 car. Now, technical problems means we have unexpectedly lost Mark. We had a couple more questions for him, but me and Ben will muddle through his last two questions as we work through it. So, Ben, you can play the role of Mark on this one.
Do I have to put on the northern accent?
Please don't.
Okay.
The question from Sean Lihan, who says, so is it official, with McLaren continuing to mix it with Red Bull and Ferrari and Merc not far behind, do we finally have a championship fight on our hands?
I'd like to say yes, Sean, but I just feel like the advantage Red Bull's built just puts it slightly out of reach. It's possible in the constructors that they get eaten up if Perez can't turn things around. But, the fact that Piastri had such a bad weekend, similarly stinky to Perez, means, it's possible that the other top teams will drop points by just having the random bad races for one or both of their drivers. I think what we're going to get from now to the end is close races. I think that's the thing that's so exciting. We're going to every weekend now, knowing that it's really tight amongst that leading four group, and you don't know who's going to steal ahead at any given moment, depending on how they execute. So I think all the races could be close, but I feel like with how good Red Bull are at executing, think how many marginal situations we've had in the last few weeks, and Verstappen's nearly always coming out the right side of those marginal situations. I think that's going to be enough to carry him to the championship again.
Yeah, I think also with the points he's already got.
Of course.
But the question was, do we finally have a championship fight on our hands? I think it might not quite get to that, but do we have a fight on our hands every race weekend? Yeah, I think we do. Yeah. Now, this order's very intense on you, Ben. Another question.
Another one for me.
This is one of your original
but
questions.
I'm myself again now. I'm not Mark.
Exactly. So you can go with your own accent. Kieran Holden says, why did Charles Leclerc not get a penalty for driving into Lando Norris? Stroll had a very similar incident with Lewis, but was far less dangerous due to the speed and the way Stroll positioned his car. But Charles was erratic and downright dangerous. A scary precedent set. And John Ayers asked a similar question about those incidents and what the appropriate penalty should have been. And just to add, this was all in FP3, so if you didn't watch FP3 you may not have seen this, but this was interesting.
Yeah, it's FP3. I don't know why people have to get so uppity in practice. It's only practice. These drivers getting so frustrated and doing silly things. I mean, the stewards ruled actually that what Leclerc did to Norris wasn't dangerous. They did rule it was erratic. It did feel a little bit like they were just looking for a kind of consistency cop-out, really, and they had an incident to rule on with Stroll, which did seem like a lesser incident, and they went, yeah, it's erratic driving, not dangerous. Stroll admitted, actually, that he'd done it to make a point, but the stewards didn't use that admission of intent to hang him, and they just went reprimand. I think they could have been harsher, but for whatever reason, they decided not to be. And then with Leclerc, I think it looked like a deliberate chop to make a point. Leclerc was very insistent that it wasn't and didn't make the same admission of intent in front of the stewards as Stroll did. I don't think the stewards bought that in their judgment. They said regardless of any apparent intent. So that suggested to me that they thought maybe he was being a bit silly, but they couldn't get him to admit it. They decided it wasn't dangerous. I mean, the contact was light, but I mean, that's by the by, really, isn't it? You shouldn't be, however frustrated you are, you shouldn't be swerving deliberately towards other cars in erratic way. So I think both drivers, particularly Leclerc, could have been punished harsher for this if the stewards wanted to make a point and set a different precedent about etiquette on track. But for whatever reason, they decided to take the easy way out.
Yeah, I'm baffled by the approach to track etiquette. They punish all sorts of genuine, completely honest racing mistakes that I wouldn't penalise. But this, for me, if you want to have a swerve and make a point.
There was something in junior categories in Melbourne, wasn't there? I think there was an F3 driver, and they didn't punish him, but they said that they should have. It should have set a precedent that wasn't acceptable.
It's stupid, but the thing for me is, there's honest mistakes, and then there's just this. Obviously, neither meant there to be contact, but they were doing something a bit erratic to make a point. And my view as a steward would be, my view is the steward should be told on that. Look, if you want to do one of those chops to make a point, fine. But if you misjudge it and you make contact, you're going to get a grid penalty, or you're even going to get benched from the next session or something, because for me that's just outside the range of normal behaviour.
It was one where I felt like the eye test was important. That's what you needed to use to inform your judgment, rather than just looking at the absolute letter of the regulations.
Exactly. It's not.
But they're obsessed with consistency now because of the constant push. For them to be more consistent. So, they're between a rock and a hard place, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. I very often the stewards are not the ones to blame. It's the wider thing. Right, a question I'll take now from Titan420, who is another of our Patreon members, who says, Spain was the first time both Alpines got into Q3. Is this a false dawn, or is Alpine starting to get back on an upward trajectory with this car? Well, they have been on an upward trajectory. They've been getting a bit better, a little bit more convincing. I think this track suits them. Not too much curb content, not too much bumps. That's good for the car, just as it's good for the Sauber. So it's only a false dawn if you think being Q3 here means they're Q3 everywhere, because they won't be. But it is showing that Alpine are making progress.
They were top 10 in Canada, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly.
Racing the RBs, who were nowhere here.
Exactly. So, I think a tidy job. They're up to 7th in the championship as well. So, yeah, positive for Alpine, but keep a sense of proportion in that it's not a complete transformation. This is going to be one of the better tracks, but that they are chipping away. Right, another of Mark's questions that I will take. So the last of Mark's questions, Nevin Knowles, again from Patreon, says, it's another race where Carlos Sainz putting his desires first cost the team. Leclerc had pace to fight for the podium, but his useless fight with Carlos at the beginning cost not only Leclerc, but also the team. Sainz has a history of this behaviour. Silverstone, Austria 2022, China 2024. I believe this behaviour played a large part in both Mercedes and Red Bull passing on him, because he doesn't play the team game and only cares for his results. I think...
Sainz fan there, do we think?
Well, I would say that nothing that you said there is kind of totally spurious by any stretch of imagination. I'd say it's maybe a slightly ungenerous interpretation analysis of Carlos Sainz. He does fight his own corner. There is a bit of that. Now he knows he's out of Ferrari. He is fighting his own corner a bit more. Charles Leclerc was a bit irritated about it, so no question.
I think that's kind of fair enough, though, isn't it?
And I think in this scenario, he is putting himself first above the team. And I think he'll think, well, if you were keeping me, I'd serve the team. There's a little bit of that for Sainz, I think. But I don't think it's a catastrophic flaw or anything in him. It's that every driver has moments like this. It's
situational, isn't it? And also, Fred Vasseur made the point afterwards that this happened, but the damage was inconsequential. So the contact was silly, but they got away with it. And Leclerc was annoyed, but Sainz still let him through later in the race so that he could attack the Mercedes with his better tyre compounds. So Sainz did play the team game later in the race. It wasn't like he was just being completely obstinate from start to finish.
And we've got a couple more Sainz questions about off-track matters. Ben Ali Hartman says, it seemed like Williams had a tougher weekend than Sauber did. Do you think their relative performances will have any influence on Carlos Sainz's decision? It's only one race, but Spain being a gauge of the true pecking order of the field has been a major talking point for weeks. Do you think this weekend could be a deciding factor for him? And of course, this is about where he signs for next year. And there's a lot of rumour that there is now a hard deadline approaching and he has to make a decision in the next few days. Although we have heard that sort of thing before, because we've had a few D-days between races before. But it does seem like it's getting to the point. We're closing in. Yeah, it's getting to the point where I think he has to make a decision.
Yeah, Christmas is coming, or I suppose it's not really Christmas for Sainz, is it? Because he wanted the Red Bull seat and that's gone.
I think it's just the mad panic for those other group of drivers who are waiting for Sainz to decide. Yeah, and then they're all going to fight it out for Haas and Alpine and what's left.
Yeah, they're all waiting on him. I think the Williams performance this weekend won't have helped if he was leaning towards Williams, because as we mentioned earlier, it's a sort of return to some of the bad old days of last season. But it is a team that is in better shape than it was and is making progress. I mean, you could throw the same criticisms at Sauber. Okay, they had a relatively better weekend here, but they've had shocking weekends earlier in the season where they were, bottom of Q1 and no hope, it looked like. So, Williams are the team that have managed to score points this season. Their pit stops have been better. I think it's, very short term, it's much of a muchness. Sainz's decision is more about what happens in the medium and longer term. And it's not an easy choice because, with the 2026 rules coming and the rebiasing towards the engines and Mercedes maybe being ahead in that game, being in a Mercedes customer team for that season could be quite a shrewd move, especially if they've solved some of these other, problems they've got with manufacturing. There's low-hanging fruit for Williams. But of course, an Audi works team, which is what Sauber will become, in the longer term beyond 2026, offers, in theory, a lot more potential than a Williams customer team. So it's not an easy decision to make. I feel like if he wants a slightly better short-term competitive proposition, he's going to go for Williams. If he wants the bigger payday and the promise of a bigger step longer term, then he's going to pick Audi.
And the final question on a similar topic from Jeff Fitzgerald, which I'll take. Should Carlos Sainz be considering Alpine as his next ride, given that they now appear to be consistently the best of the bad options available to him, at least from an on-track performance perspective? Well, he has considered Alpine. He's been very...
Does he have to sign with Flavio?
Well, he probably would have to. And in fact, Carlos Sainz Sr. was having a very conspicuous chat with Flavio Briatore just before midday today in the paddock. But Carlos Sainz, when he says he has spoken to everyone and is looking at everything, he is telling the truth. Alpine was on the radar, and that it's always worth having a conversation. However, should he be considering that? I don't really see that Alpine offers anything that Audi wouldn't, let's say. If you want to have the works team, I'd go with Audi personally. But...
A sharper short-term, a sharper F1 operation
exactly,
as it stands,
exactly.
though. Enstone versus Hinville.
Yes,
you would pick Enstone, wouldn't you?
Yes, at the moment, but then if you're looking at ultimate potential. But so I think
the investment from Audi is definitely going to outweigh what Renault would put in.
But it comes down to currently the choice is effectively Audi or Williams.
Yeah.
And I don't think Alpine displaces either of those two, both of those two options, for various arguments. But I think Alpine I would consider. I would speak with them. Briatore is coming in. He's going to play an active role, so it's worth checking, seeing what's going on, and they will do that. But yeah, I don't think Alpine should be the place that goes to the top of the list. But still, Carlos Sainz picking from a bunch of disappointing options considering the level he's operating at. And then there's all these drivers: Esteban Ocon, Valtteri Bottas, even maybe Pierre Gasly, who's still potentially on the market, are all waiting on that happening so that things can go on there. And then you've got other... I think Ollie Behrman's Haas is probably a done deal now. That's going to happen. There's no question about that. So it's just seeing what happens, and then does Jack Doohan get a seat, and does Haas miss out, and Kevin Magnussen get a reprieve and stay?
Does Ocon end up with no drive?
Exactly, because the door's closed at Alpine, and he's not in a great position at Williams. Williams don't seem that keen on the Ocon option, but anything can change because there's a quite a neat number of drivers and seats. So let's see who wins that little flurry. But as soon as people know Sainz has actually decided and committed, there's going to be a number of driver managers and drivers and teams in a bit of a frenzy to work out where they end up. So that's going to be an interesting little end point of the driver market. And of course, we'll be all over that at the race. Well, thanks to Ben and also to Mark, who unfortunately had to leave a little bit early owing to technical problems. Me and Ben are in the same room. Mark was connected via the wonders of modern communication technology, but the internet wasn't quite up to it in the end. If you'd like more from us, our YouTube channel's always packed with videos. We've got all sorts of podcasts, including Bring Back V10s, which is now heading into its 10th season, and there's loads to read on therace.com, and don't forget the hyphen if you're heading there. It's time now for us at The Race to pack up and head to the second race of this triple header, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Austrian Grand Prix.
The Athletic.